The laughter started low, rippling through the coffee shop like a cruel tide. Sarah Chen sat alone at the corner table, her worn military dog tags catching the afternoon light as she reached for her laptop bag. The college students at the next table had noticed them first, their voices rising with each mocking comment about stolen valor and fake military gear from Amazon. What they didn't know was that those tags bore a serial number that would soon catch the attention of a decorated Marine colonel sitting 3 tables away, a man who would recognize the significance of what hung around her neck in the story. Those metal pieces told. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The coffee shop buzzed with the typical afternoon energy of a college town. Steam rising from espresso machines while students hunched over textbooks and laptops. Sarah had chosen this place for its anonymity, a quiet corner where she could work on her freelance graphic design projects without drawing attention. At 28, she had grown accustomed to blending into civilian spaces, her slight frame and reserved demeanor making her nearly invisible among the boisterous college crowd. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a faded flannel shirt over jeans that had seen better days. Nothing about her appearance suggested the weight of what she carried. Both around her neck and in her memory, the dog tags had become a habit she couldn't break, a small piece of metal that connected her to a life that felt increasingly distant. She touched them unconsciously throughout the day, the way others might fidget with jewelry or worry stones. They weren't for show, weren't a statement or a plea for recognition. They were simply part of her, as natural as breathing, though she had learned to tuck them beneath her clothing when the questions became too much to bear. Today, however, the chain had slipped free of her collar, the tags catching the light as she leaned forward to plug in her laptop charger. The movement was innocent enough, but it was enough to draw the attention of the group at the neighboring table. 3 young men and 2 women, all clearly undergraduates based on their textbooks and university sweatshirts, had been engaged in animated conversation about their weekend plans when one of them noticed the glint of metal. "Oh my God, look at that," whispered one of the women, her voice carrying despite her attempt at discretion. "Is she seriously wearing dog tags?" Her companion, a young man with perfectly styled hair and an expensive laptop covered in designer stickers, followed. Her gaze, his expression shifted from curiosity to barely concealed amusement. "No way, those can't be real. Look at her, she's like, what, 5 foot nothing. There's no way she was actually in the military." The comments began quietly, almost conversational, as if Sarah couldn't hear every word from her table just feet away. They discussed her appearance with the casual cruelty of people who had never faced real consequence for their words. Too small, too quiet, too young-looking. Their analysis of her supposed deception grew bolder with each exchange, their voices rising as they convinced themselves of their own narrative. "I bet she bought those at some surplus store," one of them said, loud enough now that other patrons began to glance over. "Or ordered them online. You can get fake military stuff anywhere these days. It's so cringy when people do that for attention." Sarah's fingers stilled on her keyboard. She had learned long ago that responding to such comments rarely improved the situation. Better to finish her work and leave quietly, to avoid the confrontation that would inevitably follow any attempt to defend herself. She had tried that approach before, in other coffee shops, other public spaces, and the results were always the same. Escalation, demands for proof, skeptical examination of her explanations as if her service required their approval to be valid. Group's commentary continued, growing more elaborate with each contribution. They spun theories about her motivations, about the psychology of people who wore military gear they hadn't earned. One of them mentioned a viral video they had seen about stolen valor, about confronting people who falsely claimed military service. Their righteousness grew with their audience as other students began to listen in, some pulling out phones, as if anticipating a confrontation worth recording. "Someone should say something," one of the women declared, her voice carrying a note of performative concern. "It's disrespectful to real veterans. My brother's deployed right now, and this kind of thing is just offensive." The young man with the expensive laptop nodded sagely, as if he had been personally wronged by Sarah's presence. "Absolutely. People like this make me sick. She's probably never been within 100 miles of a military base, and here she is, playing dress-up with tags she bought on eBay." Sarah closed her laptop with deliberate care, her movements controlled despite the tension building in her shoulders. She had work to finish, deadlines to meet, but the atmosphere in the coffee shop had shifted beyond her ability to concentrate. The whispers and stares had created a bubble of hostility around her table, and she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes as more patrons became aware of the situation. As she gathered her things, preparing to leave before the situation escalated further, she noticed a man at a table across the room. He was older, probably in his 50s, with graying hair cut short and posture that spoke of decades of military bearing. He wore a simple button-down shirt and khakis, nothing that immediately identified him as military, but something in his bearing caught her attention. More importantly, he was watching the scene unfold with an expression she couldn't quite read. The decorated Marine Colonel had been enjoying a quiet cup of coffee and reviewing some documents when the college students' conversation began to intrude on his concentration. At first, he had simply noted it as the kind of background noise that came with public spaces, young people talking too loudly about things they barely understood. But as their comments grew more specific, more pointed, his attention shifted. From his paperwork to the young woman they were discussing, Colonel James Morrison had seen enough in his 30-year career to recognize certain things at a glance. The way someone carried themselves, the unconscious habits that military training instilled, the particular alertness that never quite faded even years after leaving service. The woman at the corner table displayed all of these traits, subtle but unmistakable to someone trained to notice them. More than that, something about her bearing, about the careful way she controlled her reactions to the harassment, suggested experiences that went far beyond basic military service. When the dog tags caught the light again as she moved to pack her laptop, Morrison's attention sharpened. Even from across the room, even with his aging eyes, there was something familiar about those tags. Not familiar in the sense that he recognized them personally, but familiar in the way that spoke of shared experiences, of places and times that carried weight beyond civilian understanding. He had worn his own tags for 3 decades, had seen thousands of others, and had learned to read the stories they told. The students' mockery continued, growing bolder as they fed off each other's energy and the attention of their expanding audience. They had moved beyond simple commentary into active harassment, their voices raised enough that the entire coffee shop was becoming unwilling witness to their performance. Some patrons looked uncomfortable, glancing between the students and their target, but no one intervened. The baristas behind the counter exchanged uncertain looks, clearly unsure how to handle a situation that hadn't quite crossed the line into something requiring action. Morrison watched as the young woman gathered her belongings with the kind of controlled precision that spoke of training, of situations where staying calm under pressure was literally a matter of survival. She moved with economy and purpose, wasting no motion, betraying no emotion despite the increasing hostility directed her way. It was a response pattern he had seen in combat veterans, people who had learned to compartmentalize under stress, to function despite chaos erupting around them. As Sarah stood to leave, her movement caused the dog tags to shift again, and for just a moment, the light caught them at the perfect angle. Morrison's breath caught as he glimpsed something that made his blood run cold. Numbers, a sequence that triggered recognition so sharp and immediate that he felt his pulse quicken. Those weren't random digits stamped on novelty tags from some military surplus store. Those were service numbers, specific and authentic, but more than that, they were numbers he had seen before, in context that few people outside the military would ever understand. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He knew those numbers. Not personally, not from any direct interaction, but from briefings, from classified reports, from the kind of documentation that crossed his desk in his role overseeing special operations personnel. Those numbers belonged to someone whose service record was marked with classifications that most people would never see, whose contributions were documented in files that required security clearance to access. Sarah had nearly reached the door when Morrison made his decision. The students were still talking, still building their case against her supposed deception, when he stood and crossed the room with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to command. His movement cut through the coffee shop's atmosphere like a knife, and conversations began to quiet as people sensed the shift in energy. The laughter died completely when he reached the students' table, his presence suddenly dominating the space, in a way that made their earlier bravado seem childish and small. He didn't speak immediately, instead turning to look directly at Sarah, who had paused near the exit, her hand on the door handle. Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment, an entire conversation passed between them without words. Morrison's gaze dropped to the dog tags visible against her shirt, and even from this distance, even in the shifting light of the coffee shop, he could make out enough of the numbers to confirm what he had feared. Those tags told a story that these students couldn't begin to comprehend, a story of service and sacrifice that existed in the shadows of public awareness, in the spaces between what was reported and what was classified. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of 3 decades of military leadership, but it was quiet, controlled, designed to cut through noise rather than add to it. The words he chose would change everything, would shift the entire dynamic of the room and leave no doubt about who held the real authority in this moment. The coffee shop held its breath. Students frozen with phones half raised, baristas stopped mid-motion, other patrons leaning forward to catch what was about to unfold. The decorated colonel looked once more at the young woman by the door, then turned his attention to the table of students who had no idea how dramatically their afternoon was about to change. The mission briefing had been classified at the highest levels, buried in files that required multiple security clearances to access. Colonel Morrison remembered it clearly now as he stood in the coffee shop, the pieces of a puzzle he hadn't realized he was solving suddenly clicking into place. Operation Silent Guardian had been one of those missions that officially never happened, conducted by personnel whose names would never appear in public records, whose sacrifices would never be acknowledged outside the highest echelons of military command. The operation had taken place in the mountainous regions of Afghanistan, a joint task force mission designed to extract high-value intelligence from a compound that standard military approaches couldn't touch. The location was too sensitive, the diplomatic implications too severe for conventional forces. What was needed was a small team of specialists, people who could move through hostile territory without detection, complete their objectives, and disappear without leaving evidence of American involvement. Morrison had been stationed at the Pentagon, then serving as a liaison between Special Operations Command and intelligence services. His role had been coordination and oversight, reviewing mission parameters and personnel assignments from the safety of an air-conditioned office thousands of miles from the action. But even from that distance, he had understood the gravity of what was being attempted, the level of skill and courage required from the operators selected for the mission. The team had been assembled from the most elite units across all branches of service: Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Marine Force Recon, Air Force pararescue specialists. Each member chosen not just for their combat skills, but for their ability to operate independently, to make life or death decisions in situations where communication with command was impossible and extraction was uncertain. They were the best of the best, operators whose service records read like legend, Among those selected had been Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen, a combat engineer with a specialty in explosives and structural analysis. Her file had crossed Morrison's desk during the personnel review phase, and even then, reading her qualifications on paper, he had been impressed by the scope of her training and experience. Airborne qualified, Ranger tabbed, expert marksman, fluent in 3 languages including Pashto and Dari. Her psychological evaluations showed remarkable stress tolerance and decision-making ability under pressure. Her technical skills were rated among the top 5% in her field, but it was her background that had made her particularly valuable for this specific mission. Chen had grown up in a military family, moving from base to base throughout her childhood, developing the kind of adaptability that couldn't be taught in training. Her father had been a career Air Force officer, her mother a military contractor, who specialized in communication systems. Sarah had absorbed military culture from birth, understood the nuances of military hierarchy and protocol in ways that proved invaluable in joint operations. Her selection for Operation Silent Guardian had been unanimous among the review board. On paper, she was exactly what the mission required. Young enough to move through hostile territory without attracting attention, skilled enough to handle the technical aspects of the intelligence extraction, experienced enough to adapt when the inevitable complications arose. Her combat record showed consistent performance under pressure, with commendations from superior officers who praised her ability to remain calm in situations that broke lesser soldiers. The mission itself had lasted 72 hours, 3 days. That existed in a classification level so high that most of the Pentagon personnel involved had never seen the after-action reports. Morrison knew only what his clearance level allowed, fragments of information that painted an incomplete picture of what had transpired in those Afghan mountains. The team had successfully infiltrated the target compound, extracted the required intelligence, and eliminated the high-value targets as specified in their orders. But something had gone wrong during the extraction phase. The classified reports Morrison had access to were heavily redacted, black bars covering crucial details, but the implications were clear. The team had encountered unexpected resistance, a level of enemy response that suggested their presence had been detected earlier than anticipated. What should have been a clean extraction had become a running firefight through hostile territory, with the operators forced to improvise their escape route under enemy fire. The casualty reports had been the most difficult part of Morrison's review. 4 members of the 8-person team had been killed in action, their bodies recovered and returned to their families with cover stories that protected the classified nature of their final mission. 3 others had been wounded but made it to the extraction point, where they were evacuated to military medical facilities. The 8th member of the team had been listed as missing in action, presumed dead. Her body never recovered from the mountainous terrain where the final firefight had taken place. Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen had been that 8th member. Her file had been sealed, her service record classified, her family notified of her death with the standard explanations provided to families of soldiers lost in classified operations. She had been posthumously awarded decorations that would never be publicly acknowledged, her name added to memorial walls that existed in secure facilities where only those with appropriate clearances could see them. Morrison remembered signing the paperwork that officially closed her case file, marking her as killed in action, missing, and presumed dead. It had been a routine administrative task at the time, one of dozens of similar documents that crossed his desk in those years when special operations were being conducted with increasing frequency across multiple theaters of operation. He had felt the appropriate moment of solemnity for a fallen soldier, but the classified nature of her mission meant that her sacrifice would remain known only to a small circle of military personnel. Now, standing in this college coffee shop, watching the young woman by the door, Morrison felt the careful edifice of official records crumbling around him. The Sarah Chen he had declared dead 5 years ago was very much alive, standing 15 feet away, wearing the dog tags that should have been buried with her body or returned to her family as the only remains of their daughter's service. The implications were staggering. If Chen was alive, if she had somehow survived the mission that officially killed her, then everything in her file was incorrect. Her status, her records, her very existence had been erased from military databases. She was, in the most literal sense, a ghost, someone who no longer existed in any official capacity, despite standing before him in unmistakable reality. Morrison's mind raced through the possibilities. Had she been captured and later escaped? Had she gone into hiding for reasons related to the classified nature of her mission? Had she been deliberately kept off the books for security reasons that extended beyond his clearance level? Each scenario raised more questions, implications that stretched into areas of military policy and classified operations that could affect national security. But beyond the administrative and security implications, Morrison found himself confronting a more immediate moral reality. The woman by the door was being publicly humiliated by college students who had no understanding of what they were mocking. They were laughing at dog tags that represented service of a level they couldn't comprehend, sacrifice that they would never be asked to make, courage that existed in realms far beyond their civilian experience. Chen's behavior in the face of their harassment suddenly made perfect sense. She wasn't responding because she couldn't respond. Not without revealing information that was still classified. Not without opening conversations that might compromise ongoing operations or expose details that remained sensitive years after. The fact, her silence wasn't weakness or guilt at wearing unearned decorations. It was the discipline of someone who understood that some secrets were worth protecting, even at personal cost. The weight of recognition settled on Morrison's shoulders like a familiar burden. He had spent his career making decisions that affected other people's lives, issuing orders that sent soldiers into harm's way, reviewing operations that existed in moral gray areas where conventional rules didn't apply. But this moment felt different, more personal, weighted with the kind of responsibility that extended beyond military protocol into basic human decency. The students' laughter continued, their mockery growing bolder as they interpreted Chen's silence as confirmation of their accusations. They had no idea that they were harassing someone whose service record would humble the most decorated public heroes, whose contributions to national security existed in files they would never be cleared to see. Their ignorance was understandable, even predictable, but their cruelty was still unacceptable. Morrison understood that his next actions would have consequences, extending far beyond this coffee shop confrontation. Acknowledging Chen's service would require explanations he wasn't authorized to provide, might compromise information that remained classified, could open investigations into discrepancies between official records and observable reality. But allowing her to endure continued harassment based on ignorance of her actual record was equally unacceptable. The decorated Marine Colonel had faced difficult decisions throughout his career, moments where military necessity conflicted with personal conscience, where classified requirements competed with moral imperatives. This moment felt like the culmination of all those previous choices, a test of what mattered most when everything else was stripped away. As he stood there, watching Chen prepare to leave rather than escalate the confrontation, Morrison made his decision. Some things were more important than administrative convenience or bureaucratic protocol. Some truths demanded acknowledgement regardless of the complications they might create. Some people deserved recognition even when that recognition came with personal and professional risk. The students had no idea what was about to happen. They continued their performance, building their case against what they saw as stolen valor, preparing to escalate their harassment into direct confrontation. Their phones remained ready to record what they expected would be the exposure and humiliation of someone they had judged unworthy of the uniform she had never claimed to wear. Morrison took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his 30-year career, his security clearances, his reputation, all balanced against the simple moral imperative of standing up for someone who had already given more than these students could imagine. The classified files, the sealed records, the official denials that surrounded Operation Silent Guardian would have to be measured against the reality of a decorated veteran being mocked by people who had never faced real danger. The coffee shop seemed to hold its breath as Morrison stepped forward, his movement cutting through the tension like a blade. The moment of truth had arrived, and both Chen and her harassers were about to learn that some secrets couldn't remain buried when honor demanded their exposure. Sarah Chen had learned to disappear long before she ever put on a uniform. Growing up as a military brat meant constant relocation, new schools every 18 months, the endless cycle of making friends only to leave them behind when orders came through. She had perfected the art of blending in, of becoming invisible in crowds, of observing without being observed. It was a survival skill that served her well in childhood and proved invaluable in the military, where the ability to move unseen could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The transition to civilian life should have been easier for someone with her skills, but Sarah discovered that invisibility worked differently in the civilian world. Where military invisibility was tactical, purposeful, controlled, civilian invisibility felt more like erasure. She worked as a freelance graphic designer now, taking contracts that allowed her to work from home, communicating with clients through email and video calls that kept her interactions professional and distant. The work paid enough to cover her modest expenses, and the flexibility allowed her to maintain the low profile that had become essential to her survival. Her apartment was a study in careful anonymity, furnished with pieces from discount stores and estate sales, nothing that would draw attention or suggest anything unusual about its occupant. She kept no photographs on display, no memorabilia that might reveal her past, no decorations that spoke to personal history or military service. The only hint of her former life was a small wooden box hidden in her bedroom closet, containing documents and medals that she couldn't bear to destroy, but couldn't afford to display. The dog tags were different. She wore them not as a statement or reminder, but as a talisman, a physical connection to the part of herself that officially no longer existed. They had been with her through everything, had absorbed the sweat and blood of missions she couldn't discuss, had pressed against her chest during moments when she thought they might be the only proof that she had ever lived at all. Removing them felt like cutting away part of her soul, so she wore them hidden beneath her clothing, a secret weight that grounded her in reality when the world felt too strange and disconnected. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was being accused of stolen valor while wearing tags that represented service so classified that acknowledging it would be a federal crime. Her actual military records had been sealed, sanitized, rewritten to remove any trace of her involvement in operations that officially never happened. According to the Department of Defense database, Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen had died in a training accident at Fort Bragg. Her body cremated, her family notified with appropriate solemnity and compensated according to regulations. The truth was far more complicated. Operation Silent Guardian had gone sideways in ways that no amount of planning could have anticipated. The intelligence they were sent to extract had been compromised, their insertion discovered, their extraction point overrun by hostile forces. What was supposed to be a 72-hour mission had stretched into 2 weeks of survival and evasion, with the team scattered across hostile territory and communication with command completely severed. Sarah had been separated from the main group during the initial firefight, her position overrun while she was rigging demolition charges to destroy sensitive equipment. The explosion that was meant to eliminate evidence had brought down part of the building, trapping her in a basement storage room while enemy forces swept the area above. For 6 days, she had remained hidden in that underground space, surviving on bottled water and energy bars from her kit, listening to the sounds of her teammates being hunted through the surrounding mountains. When she finally emerged, the area had gone quiet. The enemy forces had moved on, satisfied that they had eliminated the American infiltrators. The extraction point had been abandoned, no sign of friendly forces anywhere in the region. Sarah found herself alone in hostile territory, hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly position, with no communication equipment, and no way to signal her location to potential rescue teams. The journey home had taken 3 months. Moving only at night, avoiding populated areas, living off the land and occasional supply caches left by previous special operations teams. She had made her way across Afghanistan's mountainous terrain toward the Pakistani border. She had no maps, no GPS, only her training and the stars to guide her navigation. Twice she had been forced to take shelter for weeks at a time when military operations in the area made movement too dangerous. The crossing into coast to take shelter for weeks at a time when military operations in the area made movement too dangerous. The cross she had been forced to take shelter for weeks at a time when military operations in the area. Pakistan had been the most dangerous part of the journey. Border guards shot first and asked questions later, and her status as an American soldier would have made her a valuable prisoner if captured alive. She had waited for weeks, observing patrol patterns, studying the terrain, before finally slipping across during a moonless night when cloud cover provided additional concealment. Even in Pakistan, she couldn't risk contact with official American channels. Her mission had been so highly classified that revealing her survival might compromise ongoing operations or expose intelligence assets. Instead, she had made her way to Karachi, working odd jobs to earn money for passage to Europe, always staying ahead of the various intelligence services that monitored American military personnel in the region. The journey through Europe had been easier but no less dangerous. She traveled with forged documents purchased from smugglers who asked no questions, as long as payment was made in cash. France, Spain, Mexico, each border crossing a calculated risk. Each new country a step closer to home, but also deeper into illegal territory that made her survival increasingly complicated from a legal standpoint. By the time she reached the United States, nearly a year had passed since Operation Silent Guardian. Her official death had been processed, her records sealed, her family compensated. Attempting to re-establish contact with military channels would have required explanations that might compromise classified information, investigations that could expose details better left buried, questions that had no good answers. Instead, Sarah had chosen to remain dead. She created a new identity using techniques learned in survival training, established herself in a small college town where military connections were rare, and began the process of building a civilian life from nothing. The decision wasn't made lightly, but it seemed like the only option that protected both national security interests and her own survival. The psychological cost of that choice had been enormous. She existed in a liminal space between life and death, officially deceased but functionally alive, cut off from family and friends who believed her dead, unable to access benefits or recognition for service that had cost her everything. The isolation was complete and absolute, a kind of existential imprisonment that made physical captivity seem simple by comparison. Working as a freelance graphic designer provided both income and anonymity, but it also highlighted how disconnected she had become from the world around her. Her clients knew her only as an email address and a portfolio of work, interactions mediated by technology that prevented the kind of personal connections that might lead to uncomfortable questions. She completed projects efficiently and professionally, but always maintained the distance necessary to protect her secret. The coffee shop had become one of her few regular haunts, a neutral space where she could work among people without interacting with them. She chose her seating carefully, always positioned to observe exits and approaches, always aware of who was around her and what they were doing. Old habits from military training died hard, and situational awareness remained as automatic as breathing. She had noticed the college students before they noticed her, had cataloged them as typical undergraduates, loud and self-absorbed, but harmless. Their discovery of her dog tags and subsequent commentary wasn't the first time she had faced such accusations, though it was perhaps the most public and sustained. She had learned to endure such moments with silence, knowing that any attempt at explanation would only invite more questions she couldn't answer. The pain wasn't in their disbelief of her service, but in the isolation it represented. She was being mocked for wearing the only tangible connection she had to her former life, to the person she had been before the world decided she was dead. Their laughter felt like another small death, another step in the process of erasure that had defined her existence since returning from Afghanistan. As she gathered her belongings, preparing to leave before the situation escalated further, Sarah caught sight of the older man across the room. Something about his bearing triggered recognition, not of the individual, but of the type. Military, probably senior officer, definitely someone who understood the world she had once inhabited. For a moment, she wondered if he would join the students' mockery or simply ignore them, situation as most people did when confronted with conflicts that didn't directly concern them. Possibility that he might recognize something authentic in her appearance, that he might understand what the students were missing, flickered through her mind like a dangerous hope. But hope was a luxury she had learned to live without, an emotion too risky for someone whose survival depended on maintaining absolute control over her environment and circumstances. She had almost reached the door when she sensed the shift in over her environment and circumstances. She had almost reached the door when she sensed the shift in circumstances. The room's energy, the way conversations quieted and attention focused on a single point. Training and instinct made her pause, hand on the door handle, body positioned to move quickly if necessary. Behind her, she could feel the weight of eyes, the pressure of a moment that was building toward something she couldn't yet identify, but that her survival instincts warned her to be prepared for. The transformation from civilian contractor to special operations soldier hadn't happened overnight. Sarah's path to Operation Silent Guardian had begun years earlier, in the sterile corridors of Fort Bragg, where she first demonstrated the unique combination of technical expertise and combat readiness that would eventually make her invaluable to the most classified missions in the American military arsenal. Her initial military occupational specialty had been combat engineer, a role that seemed straightforward on paper, but encompassed a vast range of skills from explosive ordnance disposal to structural analysis to battlefield construction. Sarah had excelled in every aspect of the training, but it was her intuitive understanding of how things broke, how they could be made to break, and how to prevent them from breaking that caught the attention of her instructors at the engineer school, the first indication that her career would diverge from the typical enlisted path came during advanced demolitions training. While other students focused on memorizing blast calculations and standard procedures, Sarah demonstrated an almost artistic understanding of how explosives interacted with different materials and structures. She could look at a building and immediately identify the precise points where minimal charges would achieve maximum effect, could calculate load-bearing stress in her head, while others struggled with calculators and reference manuals. Her instructor, a grizzled master sergeant with 20 years of experience in special operations, had pulled her aside after a particularly impressive display of controlled demolition. "Chen," he had said, studying her with the kind of attention that made junior soldiers nervous, "how do you know where to place those charges?" Sarah had struggled to explain what seemed intuitive to her. "The building wants to fall a certain way, Sergeant. The steel and concrete have natural stress points, weak spots where the structure is already fighting itself. You just have to listen to what the building is telling you and help it along." The master sergeant had nodded slowly, making notes in a file that Sarah wouldn't see for months. That conversation had been the beginning of her recruitment into programs that existed in the shadowy spaces between conventional military training and the specialized skills required for operations that officially never happened. Selection for the Special Operations Community was a process that combined physical testing with psychological evaluation and skills assessment. Sarah had been invited to attend assessment and selection based on her performance in combat engineer training, her language skills, and recommendations from instructors who recognized her potential for unconventional operations. The 3-week selection course had been designed to break down candidates and rebuild them according to the specific requirements of special operations missions. Physical challenges were brutal but predictable. Psychological pressure was constant and deliberately disorienting. Candidates were subjected to sleep deprivation, stress positions, mock interrogations, and scenarios designed to test decision-making. Ability under extreme pressure. Sarah had thrived in the environment that broke many of her fellow candidates. Her childhood experience of constant relocation had taught her to adapt quickly to new circumstances, while her technical training provided a foundation of problem-solving skills that proved valuable in the complex scenarios presented during selection. She learned to compartmentalize stress, to function effectively despite exhaustion and discomfort, to make critical decisions with incomplete information and no time for deliberation. The graduation ceremony for successful candidates had been a small private affair. No families were invited, no photographs were taken, no records were kept that might later compromise the security of operations these soldiers would undertake. Sarah had received her new classification and assignment orders with the understanding that her previous military identity was being subsumed into something larger and more dangerous. That advanced training had taken place at facilities that didn't appear on any official maps, conducted by instructors whose names were never mentioned and whose backgrounds were never discussed. Sarah learned advanced close-quarters combat, sophisticated surveillance techniques, languages and cultural studies that would allow her to operate in hostile territories, and specialized skills in electronic warfare and communications that complemented her demolitions expertise. The training was designed to create soldiers who could operate independently for extended periods without support or communication with command. Every scenario was based on real-world operations where special operations teams had faced impossible circumstances and been forced to improvise their way to survival. Sarah learned to live off the land, to navigate by stars, to treat combat wounds with improvised materials, to maintain weapons and equipment under field conditions that would destroy conventional military gear. But it was the psychological preparation that proved most challenging and most crucial. Special operations soldiers were required to compartmentalize their emotions, to function effectively in situations where conventional moral frameworks provided no guidance, to make life and death decisions for themselves and others without the luxury of time or consultation. The training scenarios became increasingly complex, forcing candidates to confront situations where every choice carried terrible consequences and perfect solutions didn't exist. Sarah's handlers had been particularly interested in her technical skills and her ability to work with minimal supervision. Her final training exercise had involved infiltrating a mock enemy facility, analyzing its structural weaknesses, and developing a demolition plan that would destroy the target while preserving adjacent buildings that supposedly housed civilian populations. The scenario had been designed to test her ability to balance mission objectives with collateral damage considerations, to make technical decisions under pressure while maintaining awareness of broader strategic implications. Her solution had been elegant and devastating. Rather than using conventional explosives that would have caused widespread destruction, Sarah had identified key structural elements whose removal would cause a controlled collapse limited to the target building. Her plan required precision, timing, and expert placement of charges, but would achieve mission objectives while minimizing civilian casualties. The instructors had been impressed not just by her technical competence, but by her ability to think creatively under pressure, to find solutions that others had missed. The assignment to Operation Silent Guardian had come after months of additional, specialized training focused on the specific challenges of the Afghan theater. Sarah learned Pashto and Dari, studied regional cultural practices and political dynamics, familiarized herself with terrain and weather patterns that would affect operations in mountainous regions. She practiced with weapons and equipment specifically chosen for the mission, including specialized demolition charges, designed to be undetectable to standard security screening. The team selection process had been another level of vetting entirely. Each member was chosen not just for their individual skills, but for their ability to work effectively with the specific other operators who would comprise the mission team. Psychological compatibility was assessed through exercises that simulated the stress and isolation of extended operations in hostile territory. Sarah had been selected not only for her technical expertise, but for her ability to maintain emotional stability and team cohesion under extreme stress. Mission preparation had taken place over several months at a classified facility that replicated the conditions they would face in Afghanistan. The team trained together daily, practicing infiltration techniques, communication protocols, extraction procedures, and contingency plans for scenarios where the primary mission objectives became impossible to achieve. Every aspect of the operation was rehearsed until it became automatic, until each team member could execute their role flawlessly, even under conditions of exhaustion, injury, or equipment failure. The intelligence briefings had revealed the scope and importance of their objectives. The target compound housed computer systems containing information about terrorist networks across Central Asia, data that could prevent attacks against American interests and provide strategic advantages in ongoing operations throughout the region. The compound was too heavily defended for conventional military assault, too politically sensitive for airstrikes, too important to ignore. Only a small team of specialists could achieve the mission objectives without triggering international incidents that might compromise American foreign policy throughout the region. Sarah's specific role had been to breach the compound's security systems, disable backup power supplies, and plant demolition charges that would destroy the facility after intelligence extraction was complete. Her expertise in both electronic systems and controlled demolition made her uniquely qualified for tasks that required technical precision under combat conditions. The mission planners had emphasized that her contributions would be crucial to both mission success and team survival. The final briefing had taken place just hours before deployment. Intelligence updates, weather reports, confirmation of extraction protocols, and final equipment checks. Each team member had been given emergency contact procedures and cover stories to use if captured, though everyone understood that the classified nature of the mission made rescue unlikely if things went wrong. They were going into Afghanistan with the understanding that success or failure, survival or death, would depend entirely on their own skills and determination. As Sarah sat in the coffee shop years later, listening to college students mock the visible proof of that service, she could still remember the weight of the equipment pack as she boarded the transport aircraft, the faces of teammates she would never see again, the mixture of anticipation and dread that preceded every special operations mission. The dog tags around her neck had absorbed the sweat of that final briefing, had pressed against her chest during the long flight into hostile territory, had been her only companion during the months of survival and evasion that followed the missions. Catastrophic conclusion: the technical skills that had made her valuable to special operations remained sharp even in civilian life, though she applied them now to graphic design projects rather than demolition targets. The psychological training that had prepared her for isolation and stress served her well in a life where maintaining her secret required constant vigilance and emotional control. But the sense of purpose the connection to something larger than herself, the brotherhood of arms that had given meaning to the danger and sacrifice. Those things were lost to her now, existing only in memories that she couldn't share and experiences that officially never happened. The afternoon energy in the coffee shop had reached a crescendo of cruelty that seemed to feed on itself, growing bolder with each exchange among the college students who had appointed themselves arbiters of military authenticity. What had begun as whispered observations had evolved into a public performance, with the students increasingly confident in their assessment of Sarah as a fraud deserving of exposure and humiliation. Brandon Mitchell, the young man with the expensive laptop and perfectly styled hair, had emerged as the unofficial leader of the group's harassment campaign. His father owned a chain of car dealerships across 3 states, providing Brandon with the kind of financial security that allowed him to treat college as an extended social experiment rather than preparation for economic necessity. He had never known real hardship, never faced genuine consequences for his actions, and had developed the particular brand of arrogance that came from a life insulated from accountability. "This is exactly what's wrong with our society," Brandon declared, his voice carrying across the coffee shop with the righteousness of someone who believed his opinions carried special weight. "People think they can just appropriate military culture for attention. It's stolen valor, plain and simple, and it's insulting to everyone who actually served." His companion, Jessica Walsh, nodded enthusiastically while adjusting the phone in her hands to better capture what she anticipated would be a confrontation worth sharing on social media. Jessica studied communications with a focus on digital marketing, and she possessed an instinctive understanding of what content would generate engagement across various platforms. The prospect of exposing stolen valor was exactly the kind of morally justified drama that her followers would eagerly consume and share. "My uncle was in Iraq," Jessica added, her voice taking on the tone of personal injury that she used when discussing any topic where she could claim secondary victimhood. "He would be so offended by this. Real veterans sacrifice everything, and then people like her just buy fake tags online and pretend they understand what military service means." The third member of their group, Marcus Rodriguez, had been quieter initially but found his voice as the harassment gained momentum. Marcus came from a working-class family where military service was common and respected, though he had chosen college over enlistment when his time came to decide. His silence in the face of the group's mockery stemmed partly from discomfort with their approach, but social pressure and the desire to belong had gradually overcome his reservations. "We should definitely say something," Marcus said, though his tone carried less conviction than his words suggested. "I mean, if she's really wearing fake tags, that's actually illegal, right? Stolen valor is like a federal crime or something." The 2 other members of their group, twins named Ashley and Amanda Chen, no relation to Sarah despite the shared surname, had been documenting the entire episode with their phones, switching between video recording and still photography as they anticipated the confrontation to come. The twins were influencer wannabes with modest followings on multiple platforms, always seeking content that might generate viral attention and boost their social media presence. "This is going to get so many views," Ashley whispered to her sister, adjusting her angle to capture both Sarah and the group's commentary. Stolen valor exposure videos always blow up, especially when it's someone who looks so obviously fake. Amanda nodded while checking her follower count, already composing the caption she would use when posting the confrontation. "Right? Like, she doesn't even look military. No way someone that small and quiet was ever actually in combat. She probably bought those tags at some army surplus store and thought no one would notice." Their conversation had attracted attention from other patrons, creating a widening circle of observers who were becoming unwilling participants in the public shaming campaign. Some customers looked uncomfortable with the escalating harassment, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact with either Sarah or her tormentors. Others seemed entertained by the drama, pulling out their own phones to record what promised to be an interesting confrontation. The baristas behind the counter exchanged nervous glances, uncertain how to handle a situation that hadn't quite crossed the line into something requiring intervention, but was clearly making many customers uncomfortable. The coffee shop's manager, a college senior named David who worked part-time to help pay for his psychology degree, watched the scene unfold with growing concern but hesitated to act. Without clear evidence of actual misconduct, Brandon stood up from his table, his movement deliberate and theatrical as he prepared to confront Sarah directly. His laptop remained open, displaying an expensive trading platform where he managed investments funded by his father's money, a visual reminder of the privileged position from which he felt entitled to judge others. His confidence had been building. Throughout the afternoon's commentary, fed by the approval of his friends and the attention of their growing audience. "Excuse me," he called across the coffee shop, his voice loud enough to ensure that everyone present would witness the confrontation. "Miss, could we talk to you for a minute?" Sarah paused at the door, her hand resting on the handle as she calculated her options. Every instinct trained into her through years of special operations experience urged her to leave immediately, to avoid the confrontation that would inevitably escalate if she engaged with her harassers. But something in the tone of Brandon's voice, the mixture of condescension and certainty, triggered a different kind of response. She turned slowly, her movement controlled and economical in the way that military training had made automatic. Her eyes swept the room, cataloging exits and obstacles, assessing the positions and postures of everyone present with the kind of situational awareness that came from operating in environments where such assessments could mean the difference between life and death. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Is there something you need? Sarah asked, her voice quiet but carrying clearly across the space between them. She made no move to approach their table, maintaining the distance that would give her options if the situation required them. Brandon's grin widened as he interpreted her response as confirmation that she was willing to engage, unaware that her apparent compliance was actually strategic positioning. "Well, we couldn't help but notice your dog tags," he said, gesturing toward the metal visible against her shirt. "They're really impressive, very authentic looking." The sarcasm in his voice was unmistakable, drawing approving chuckles from his companions and nervous silence from other patrons who recognized the cruelty of his approach. Jessica raised her phone higher, ensuring she captured both Sarah's face and Brandon's performance for later posting and analysis. "Thank you," Sarah replied, her tone neutral and giving nothing away. She had learned long ago that engaging with such provocations rarely improved the situation, but she also understood that attempting to leave at this point might provoke an even more aggressive response. "Oh, come on," Jessica interjected, her voice taking on the fake sweetness that she used when she wanted to sound reasonable while being deliberately cruel. "We're all friends here. Why don't you tell us about your service? What branch were you in? Where did you serve? What was your MOS?" The questions came rapid fire, designed to trap Sarah in inconsistencies or expose her supposed ignorance of military terminology. Jessica had done enough research on stolen valor to know the basic questions that would reveal a fake, and she was confident that Sarah would quickly expose herself as a fraud when pressed for specific details about her supposed military experience. Sarah recognized the interrogation technique, the way the questions were structured to create pressure and force mistakes. She had been subjected to far more sophisticated questioning during her training, had faced interrogators whose skills far exceeded anything these college students could imagine. But the classified nature of her actual service made providing truthful answers impossible without revealing information that remained sensitive years after her supposed death. "I served," she said simply, offering no additional details that might satisfy their curiosity or provide ammunition for further harassment. Her response was truthful as far as it went, but deliberately incomplete in ways that she knew would frustrate her questioners. "That's not really an answer, is it?" Brandon pressed, taking a step closer to Sarah's position near the door. "I mean, if you really served, you should be proud to talk about it. Unless there's something you're hiding?" The implication hung in the air like a challenge, drawing murmurs from the assembled crowd as people began to choose sides in the developing confrontation. Some observers seemed to support Brandon's aggressive questioning, viewing it as justified. Skepticism about someone who they assumed was making false claims about military service. Others appeared uncomfortable with the public nature of the harassment. Regardless of their opinions about Sarah's authenticity, Marcus stood up to join. Brandon, his earlier hesitation overcome by peer pressure and the momentum of the group's collective judgment. "Look, we're not trying to be mean," he said, though his words contradicted the obvious cruelty of their approach. "It's just that stolen valor is a real problem, and it hurts actual veterans when people fake military service for attention or sympathy." The twins continued recording, their phones capturing every word and gesture as they anticipated the moment when Sarah would either confess to her supposed deception or be exposed through her inability to answer their questions. Their excitement was barely contained. Recognizing that they were potentially documenting content that could generate significant social media engagement, Ashley stepped forward with her phone extended toward Sarah's face, the camera close enough to capture intimate details of her expression and reactions. "Just show us your military ID," she demanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who believed she had caught a criminal in the act. "If you really served, you should have identification that proves it." The request represented a fundamental misunderstanding of how military identification worked, particularly for personnel involved in classified operations. But Sarah knew that explaining the complexities would only invite more questions she couldn't answer. The dog tags around her neck were authentic proof of her service, but they contained information that these students couldn't interpret and wouldn't believe even if they could. Amanda moved to flank Sarah's other side, ensuring that their documentation captured multiple angles of what they expected would be her humiliating exposure. "Come on," she said, her tone mixing false encouragement with obvious threat. "If you've got nothing to hide, just prove it. Show us something that proves you were really in the military." The circle was tightening, both literally and figuratively, as more students and other patrons moved closer to witness the confrontation. Sarah found herself surrounded by hostile faces and recording devices, trapped in a situation that was rapidly escalating beyond her ability to control through passive resistance or strategic withdrawal. Behind the growing crowd, Colonel Morrison continued to observe the scene with increasing tension, his hands clenched at his sides as he struggled with the decision of whether and how to intervene. The classified nature of Sarah's actual service complicated any potential response he might make, but the cruelty of her treatment was becoming impossible to ignore. The moment had arrived when silence was no longer an option. When the accumulated pressure of accusation and mockery demanded some kind of response. Sarah stood at the center of the hostile circle, her authentic service reduced to a subject of entertainment for people who had never faced real danger, her sacrifice dismissed by those who had never been asked to sacrifice anything themselves. The tension in the coffee shop had reached a breaking point, the air thick with anticipation as phones recorded and voices pressed for answers that Sarah could not provide without compromising national security. The circle of students had tightened around her, their demands growing more aggressive with each passing moment. When Colonel Morrison finally stepped forward with the decisive authority of someone accustomed to command. "Stand down," Morrison's voice cut through the noise like a blade, sharp and unmistakable in its authority. The command carried the weight of 3 decades of military leadership, delivered with the kind of presence that could silence a room full of arguing officers. Every conversation stopped, every phone lowered slightly, as the coffee shop's attention shifted to the gray-haired man who had just transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Brandon turned toward the voice, his expression shifting from confident aggression to confused uncertainty as he found himself facing someone whose bearing suggested real authority rather than the performative righteousness he had been displaying. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice carrying a note of challenge that was undermined by the sudden nervousness in his posture. Morrison ignored Brandon entirely. His attention focused solely on Sarah as he crossed the remaining distance between them. His movement was purposeful and controlled, designed to establish his presence without appearing threatening to the civilian observers, who had no context for understanding what was about to unfold. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter but somehow carried even more weight than his initial command. "Staff Sergeant Chen," he said, the rank and name dropping into the silence like stones into still water. "It's been a long time." The effect of his words was immediate and dramatic. Sarah's carefully controlled expression shifted, surprise and recognition flickering across her features before she could suppress them. The students who had been so confident in their accusations suddenly found themselves confronting evidence that contradicted everything they had assumed about the woman they had been harassing. Morrison reached into his wallet and withdrew his military identification, holding it up so that everyone present could see the insignia and credentials that established his authority to speak on military matters. "Colonel James Morrison, United States Marine Corps," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the coffee shop. 30 years of active service, currently assigned to Special Operations Command liaison duties at the Pentagon. The identification card caught the light as he held it, the official seals and photographs providing undeniable proof of his credentials. Several patrons leaned closer to examine the ID, their expressions shifting as they realized they were witnessing something far more significant than the simple stolen valor exposure they had anticipated. Brandon's confidence evaporated as he processed the implications of Morrison's intervention. "Look, sir, we were just trying to prevent stolen valor," he said, his earlier aggression replaced by defensive justification. "She was wearing military tags, and when we asked her about her service, she couldn't provide any details. We thought she was faking it for attention." Morrison's gaze swept over the assembled students with the kind of withering assessment that could reduce experienced soldiers to stammering apologies. "You thought," he repeated, his tone making clear exactly what he thought of their presumptions. "Tell me, son, what's your experience with military personnel records? How many classified operations have you reviewed? What's your security clearance level?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, highlighting the complete lack of qualifications these students possessed to judge anyone's military service. Brandon opened his mouth to respond, then closed it as he realized that any answer would only emphasize his ignorance of the matters he had been so confidently discussing. Morrison stepped closer to Sarah, his movement positioning him between her and her harassers in a gesture that was both protective and respectful. When he spoke to her, his voice carried a different tone, one that acknowledged shared experiences and mutual respect between military professionals. "These tags," he said, gesturing toward the metal visible against her shirt, "they're not the kind you buy at surplus stores. The serial numbers, the specific formatting, the wear patterns, they tell a story that most people wouldn't understand." He paused, studying the tags more closely, and Sarah could see the moment when recognition fully dawned in his eyes. "Those numbers," Morrison continued, his voice dropping slightly as he processed what he was seeing, "they're from a very specific program. A program that most people with my clearance level have never heard of, involving operations that officially never happened." He looked directly at Sarah, and she could see in his expression that he understood exactly who she was and what those tags represented. Jessica, still recording with her phone, pressed forward despite the shift in atmosphere. "But sir, she still hasn't provided any proof of her service," she said, her influencer instincts overriding her awareness that the situation had moved far beyond her understanding. "Anyone can claim to be military. We were just asking for verification." Morrison turned toward Jessica with the kind of attention that made seasoned officers uncomfortable. "Verification," he repeated, the word carrying multiple layers of meaning. "Tell me, what kind of verification would satisfy you? A DD-214? Service records? Unit assignments?" His voice became increasingly pointed with each question. "What if I told you that some service records are classified at levels that require presidential authorization to access? What if the operations this person participated in were so sensitive that acknowledging their existence would compromise national security?" The implications of his questions began to settle over the assembled crowd like a heavy blanket. The students who had been so certain of Sarah's deception found themselves confronting the possibility that they had been harassing someone whose service existed in realms they couldn't comprehend. Marcus, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the group's approach, stepped back from the confrontation as he realized how badly they had misjudged the situation. "We didn't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We thought she was just someone pretending to be military for attention." "You didn't know," Morrison agreed, his tone making clear that ignorance was not an excuse for the behavior they had displayed. "But you were willing to publicly humiliate someone based on your assumptions. You were prepared to record and share that humiliation without any actual knowledge of the facts you claimed to be exposing." He gestured toward the phones that were still recording, though their operators now held them with less confidence than before. "How many of those recordings will you post now? How many of your followers will see the moment when you realized you were wrong? Will your content include the apology you owe this woman? Or will you edit the footage to maintain the narrative that makes you look good?" The question struck at the heart of social media culture. The way information was manipulated and context was removed to serve the content creator's agenda rather than truth. Several of the recording phones lowered as their operators realized that their anticipated viral content had become evidence of their own ignorance and cruelty. Morrison returned his attention to Sarah, his expression softening slightly as he addressed her directly. "I want you to know," he said, his voice carrying the weight of official recognition, "that your service has not gone unnoticed or unappreciated. There are people at the highest levels of command who remember Operation Silent Guardian, who understand what you and your teammates accomplished, and who know the price that was paid for that success." The mention of the operation's name caused Sarah's breath to catch. A visible reaction confirmed Morrison's recognition of her identity and service. For years, she had lived with the knowledge that her contributions existed only in classified files that few people would ever see, that her sacrifice had been officially erased to protect operational security. Hearing the mission acknowledged, even obliquely, by someone with the authority to know the truth was overwhelming. "The official records may not reflect the complete truth," Morrison continued, his words carefully chosen to acknowledge her situation. "Without revealing classified details, but the people who matter, the people who make decisions about national security and military operations, they know. Your service mattered then, and it matters now." Ashley and Amanda, the twin influencers who had been documenting everything, slowly lowered their phones as they realized they were witnessing something far more significant than the simple confrontation they had anticipated. Their understanding of military culture was limited, but they recognized the gravity of what Morrison was saying, the weight of official recognition being offered to someone they had dismissed as a fraud. The coffee shop had fallen completely silent. Every patron focused on the interaction between the decorated colonel and the quiet woman they had watched being harassed. The baristas behind the counter stood frozen, recognizing that they were witnessing something that transcended the normal boundaries of their workplace, something that connected to larger questions of service and sacrifice that most civilians never encountered. Brandon made one final attempt to salvage his position, his voice smaller now but still carrying a note of defensive justification. But sir, how are we supposed to know? She looks so young, so small. She doesn't look like what people expect from combat veterans. Morrison's response was swift and cutting. What exactly do you think combat veterans look like, son? Do you think they all fit some Hollywood stereotype? Do you think service and sacrifice are determined by height and weight? He gestured toward Sarah. Some of the most effective operators I've known have been people who could blend into civilian populations, who didn't advertise their capabilities, who understood that real strength often comes in packages that don't match popular expectations. The rebuke hung in the air, highlighting not just the student's ignorance but the broader, cultural misunderstanding of what military service actually looked like. The gap between civilian perception and military reality had been exposed in the harshest possible terms, leaving no room for the students to maintain their earlier certainty. Morrison reached into his pocket and withdrew a business card, handing it to Sarah with the formality of an official transaction. "If you ever need anything," he said, his voice carrying both respect and genuine concern, "anything at all related to your service or your current situation, please don't hesitate to contact me. There are resources available, support systems that exist specifically for people in circumstances like yours." Sarah accepted the card with hands that trembled slightly, the first sign of emotion she had allowed herself to display throughout the entire confrontation. The simple gesture represented more than professional courtesy. It was acknowledgement, validation, a bridge back to the military community she had been forced to leave behind when her official existence was erased. The moment stretched between them, loaded with shared understanding of classified realities that the civilian observers could sense but not comprehend. In that silence, the true scope of what had transpired in the coffee shop became clear. Not just the exposure of ignorant assumptions, but the recognition of service that had been hidden in plain sight, sacrifice that had been dismissed by those who had never been asked to sacrifice anything themselves. The silence that followed Morrison's acknowledgement seemed to expand, filling every corner of the coffee shop with a weight that pressed against the consciousness of everyone present. The students who had been so vocal in their accusations now found themselves unable to meet Sarah's eyes, their phones hanging useless at their sides as they grappled with the magnitude of their mistake. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was palpable, as if the very air had shifted to accommodate a truth that no one had expected to encounter. Brandon was the first to break, his carefully constructed confidence crumbling as the full implications of Morrison's words settled over him. The expensive laptop, the designer clothes, the entitled attitude that had carried him through 21 years of privileged existence, none of it provided any protection against the moral weight of what he had done. His face flushed red as he realized that his performance had been recorded not just by his friends, but by other patrons, creating a permanent record of his ignorance and cruelty. "IWDIDN single quotes T. He began, then stopped as words failed him. "How do you apologize for publicly humiliating someone whose service existed in realms beyond your comprehension? How do you acknowledge that your assumptions were not just wrong, but founded on a fundamental misunderstanding of what sacrifice actually meant?" The social media generation's instinct for quick apologies and superficial accountability felt inadequate. In the face of what had transpired, Jessica lowered her phone completely, the screen going dark as she realized that the content she had been so eager to capture had become evidence of something she would never want to share. Her followers expected drama and controversy, but not the kind that revealed her own moral failures with such stark clarity. The influencer's carefully cultivated image of being socially conscious and ethically aware had been shattered by her willingness to participate in the harassment of someone whose actual service dwarfed anything she had ever experienced. "Ma'am," Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm so sorry. We had no right to question you, no right to assume anything about your service. The apology felt hollow even as she spoke it, inadequate compensation for the public humiliation they had subjected Sarah to based on nothing more than their own prejudices and ignorance. Marcus stepped forward, his working-class background making him perhaps more aware than his companions of the gravity of what military service actually entailed. His own family's military tradition had given him exposure to veterans, to the quiet dignity that often characterized those who had seen combat, and he recognized that Sarah's demeanor should have warned him away from his friend's cruel game. "We were completely out of line," Marcus said, his voice carrying genuine remorse rather than the performative apology of someone trying to avoid consequences. "My grandfather served in Vietnam, and if he knew what we just did..." He trailed off, unable to complete the thought as he imagined explaining this incident to a family that had raised him to respect military service unconditionally. The twins, Ashley and Amanda, stood frozen with their phones at their sides. Their influencer instincts, completely overwhelmed by the realization that they had been documenting their own moral failure, rather than someone else's exposure. Their carefully crafted online personas were built around appearing sophisticated and socially aware, but the footage they had captured revealed them as cruel and ignorant, participating in the harassment of someone whose service they couldn't begin to understand. "We'll delete everything," Ashley said suddenly, her voice cracking with emotion as she realized the implications of what they had recorded. "All the videos, all the photos. We won't post anything. We're so sorry." The promise felt inadequate, but it was all they could offer in the face of their massive misjudgment. Amanda nodded frantically, already accessing her phone to begin the deletion process. "We never should have assumed anything. We never should have said those things." Her hands shook as she worked, deleting files that contained evidence of cruelty she wished she could erase from reality as easily as she could remove it from her. Device. Morrison watched the students' reactions with the stern assessment of someone who had spent decades evaluating the character and judgment of military personnel. Their distress was genuine, but he also understood that good intentions after the fact could not undo the harm they had caused. The public humiliation they had subjected Sarah to was part of a larger pattern of civilian misunderstanding and disrespect that affected veterans across the country. "Your apologies are noted," Morrison said, his tone carrying the authority of someone delivering an official evaluation. "But this incident represents more than just a misunderstanding between individuals. It reflects a broader failure to understand what military service entails, particularly for those whose contributions exist outside public recognition." He gestured toward the other patrons who had witnessed the confrontation, many of whom were still recording or taking photos with their phones. "How many of you were prepared to watch someone be humiliated based on assumptions you had no way of verifying? How many of you were willing to be entertained by what you thought was the exposure of stolen valor without considering that you might be witnessing the harassment of a genuine veteran?" The questions hung in the air like an indictment, forcing everyone present to confront their own complicity in what had transpired. Some patrons looked away, uncomfortable with the moral examination Morrison was conducting, while others nodded in acknowledgement of their failure to intervene when they witnessed what appeared to be bullying. David, the coffee shop manager who had been watching the entire incident unfold, finally stepped forward from behind the counter. His psychology training had given him some understanding of group dynamics and bystander behavior, but witnessing it in real time was different from reading about it in textbooks. "I should have intervened earlier," he said, his voice carrying the weight of professional and personal failure. "When I saw what was happening, I should have stopped it immediately." Morrison nodded approvingly at David's acknowledgement of responsibility. "Recognition of failure is the first step toward preventing its repetition," he said, his tone suggesting that David's willingness to accept responsibility elevated him above those who had actively participated in the harassment. But institutional policies need to support individual courage. What procedures does this establishment have for protecting customers from harassment? The question highlighted a gap that many businesses faced when confronted with situations that fell into gray areas between customer service and public safety. David realized that his training had not prepared him for scenarios where customers were being systematically harassed by other customers, particularly in cases where the harassment was based on assumptions about military service. "We'll develop better protocols," David promised, though he knew that policies created after the fact could not undo the harm that had already been done. Staff training, intervention procedures, clear guidelines about when and how to act when customers are being harassed. Several other patrons began to approach, their expressions mixing shame with genuine desire to make amends for their failure. To act. An older woman who had been sitting near the window stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion as she addressed Sarah directly. "My son is deployed overseas right now," she said, tears visible in her eyes, and the thought that someone might treat him the way you were treated today, that people might question his service based on how he looks or sounds. She couldn't finish the sentence, overcome by the parallel between Sarah's situation and the potential future harassment her own child might face. A young man who appeared to be a graduate student approached next, his laptop bag marked with patches from various social justice organizations. "I study media ethics," he said, his voice carrying professional as well as personal shame. "And what happened here today represents everything wrong with social media culture. The rush to judgment, the willingness to humiliate people for content, the assumption that public shaming is justified when we think someone is doing something wrong." Morrison listened to each apology and acknowledgement with the patience of someone conducting an after-action review, evaluating not just the immediate responses, but the broader lessons that could be extracted from the incident. His military training had taught him that failures were opportunities for learning, but only if they were thoroughly examined and honestly assessed. "The damage here extends beyond individual hurt feelings," Morrison explained, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood institutional consequences. When veterans are subjected to public harassment based on civilian assumptions about what military service looks like, it creates an environment where those who have served feel unwelcome in the communities they protected. It contributes to isolation, to the sense that civilian society neither understands nor appreciates the sacrifices made on its behalf. Sarah, who had remained largely silent throughout the aftermath of Morrison's intervention, finally spoke. Her voice was quiet but clear, carrying across the coffee shop with the kind of authority that came from genuine experience rather than assumed expertise. "The hardest part," she said, her words measured and deliberate, "isn't the questioning or the assumptions, it's the isolation. When your service exists in classified files, when the people you served with are officially dead, when your own existence has been erased from military records for operational security, moments like this remind you how completely you've been cut off from the community that once defined your entire life." Her words revealed layers of complexity that the students couldn't have imagined when they began their harassment campaign. The implications of classified service, of operations that officially never happen, of veterans whose contributions existed in shadows beyond public recognition. These realities existed far outside the civilian understanding of military service. Morrison nodded gravely at Sarah's explanation, recognizing the particular challenges faced by veterans of special operations whose service could never be fully acknowledged or understood by the public they had protected. The classification requirements that protect national security also create unique burdens for those who served in sensitive roles, he said, his words carrying official weight. Society benefits from their sacrifice while remaining largely unaware that the sacrifice was made. The coffee shop had become an impromptu classroom, with Morrison and Sarah serving as unwilling instructors in the complex realities of military service and veteran reintegration. The lessons being taught were not academic but visceral, driven by the emotional impact of witnessing real harm caused by ignorant assumptions and casual cruelty. As the immediate aftermath of the confrontation began to settle, the long-term implications of what had transpired started to become clear. The students would carry this experience forward, hopefully with greater wisdom and humility. The other patrons had been forced to confront their own complicity in a system that allowed harassment to continue unchecked. The business would implement new policies, though whether those policies would be effective remained to be seen. But for Sarah, the recognition offered by Morrison represented something more significant than apologies or policy changes. It was acknowledgement, validation, a bridge back to the military community she had been forced to abandon when her official existence was erased to protect operational security. The coffee shop began to empty gradually as the immediate tension dissipated, patrons departing with subdued conversations and thoughtful expressions that suggested the afternoon's events would be discussed long after they left the establishment. The students who had initiated the harassment gathered their belongings with the mechanical movements of people processing shock, their earlier confidence replaced by a sobering awareness of their own capacity for cruelty when armed with incomplete information and social media platforms. Sarah remained near the door, Morrison's business card held carefully in her hands like a lifeline she hadn't expected to receive. The weight of recognition, of being seen and acknowledged by someone who understood the classified reality of her service, was almost overwhelming after years of invisibility and isolation. She studied the card's official letterhead, the Pentagon address, the symbols of legitimate military authority that represented a world she had been forced to abandon. Morrison approached her with the deliberate respect reserved for interactions between military professionals, his bearing acknowledging both her service and the unique circumstances that had led to this moment. "Staff Sergeant Chen," he said, his voice low enough to ensure their conversation remained private despite the public setting. "I want you to understand that what happened here today was not just a civilian misunderstanding. It was a failure of the system that should have better supported your transition." Sarah looked up from the business card, meeting Morrison's eyes with the direct gaze that military training had instilled in all successful operators. "Colonel, with respect, the system worked exactly as it was designed to work. My death was necessary for operational security. The classification of my service was necessary to protect ongoing missions. The isolation was necessary to maintain the fiction that Operation Silent Guardian never happened." Her words carried the weight of someone who had thought deeply about the choices that led to her current situation, who understood the strategic necessities that had required her sacrifice, even as she lived with the personal consequences. Morrison recognized the tone, the careful analysis that special operations personnel applied to even their own circumstances, evaluating outcomes through the lens of mission requirements rather than personal comfort. "Necessary, yes, Morrison." "Agreed, but that doesn't mean the personal cost was acceptable or that we shouldn't try to find ways to mitigate that cost when possible." He gestured toward his business card. "There are programs, support networks, ways to provide assistance that don't compromise operational security. People in circumstances similar to yours, who need help navigating the complex space between official non-existence and actual survival needs." The conversation was taking place in code, both participants aware that certain details could not be discussed even in private, that the classified nature of Sarah's service created boundaries around what could be acknowledged explicitly. But within those constraints, Morrison was offering something more valuable than simple recognition, practical assistance from people who understood her unique situation. Sarah's response was carefully measured, reflecting years of practice in compartmentalizing information and emotions. "I've managed to build a sustainable civilian life. The work provides adequate income, the location offers appropriate anonymity, and the isolation is manageable most of the time." She paused, glancing toward the students who were still gathering there, the longings with obvious discomfort. Incidents like today are reminders of the disconnect between civilian perceptions and military realities, but they're not frequent enough to require intervention. Morrison studied her response with the analytical skills that had served him well in evaluating personnel for sensitive assignments. Sarah's words suggested competence and stability, but he also heard the undertones of someone who had learned to accept a level of isolation that should not be necessary, who had adapted to circumstances that were sustainable, but not optimal. Sustainability isn't the same as thriving, Morrison observed, his tone carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades assessing the well-being of military personnel. The fact that you can manage your current circumstances doesn't mean those circumstances are what you deserve after your level of service and sacrifice. The distinction between survival and flourishing was one that many veterans struggled with, particularly those whose service had been in roles that civilian society couldn't understand or acknowledge. Sarah's ability to function in her current situation was impressive, but Morrison recognized signs of someone who had accepted limitations that might be unnecessary if appropriate support were available. Brandon approached hesitantly, his earlier bravado completely absent as he struggled to find words adequate to the magnitude of his misjudgment. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know there's nothing I can say that will make this right, but I want you to know that I'm going to use this experience to become a better person. I'm going to educate myself about military service, about the complexities of veteran experiences, about the harm that assumptions and ignorance can cause." Sarah turned toward him with the patience of someone who had learned to manage difficult conversations without escalating conflict. "The most important lesson you can take from this," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "is that people's stories are usually more complex than they appear on the surface. Military service, veteran experiences, the transition to civilian life, these things exist in dimensions that social media and popular culture don't capture accurately." Brandon nodded frantically, eager to demonstrate that he was absorbing the lesson being offered. "I want to do something positive with this. Maybe volunteer with veteran organizations, or help educate other people about the assumptions we make. I know I can't undo what happened, but I want to make sure it contributes to something good." The desire for redemption was genuine, though. Morrison and Sarah both recognized the pattern of privileged individuals seeking to transform their moral failures into opportunities for personal growth and social recognition. The impulse to turn this experience into a platform for Brandon's own development was understandable, but also needed to be tempered with genuine humility and sustained commitment rather than performative gestures. Actions matter more than intentions, Morrison said, his tone carrying the authority of someone who had evaluated countless promises of improvement over the years. "If you're serious about learning from this experience, then commit to long-term education and service rather than short-term gestures that make you feel better about what happened today." Jessica approached next, her phone conspicuously absent from her hands as she struggled to articulate her own remorse. "I've deleted everything," she said, her voice carrying the shame of someone who had realized how badly she had misjudged the situation, all the videos, all the photos. "And I want to learn more about veteran issues, about the challenges people face when transitioning to civilian life." Sarah appreciated the gesture while also recognizing its limitations. "The deletion of the recordings is important," she acknowledged, "but the education you're promising needs to go beyond just learning facts. It needs to include developing the judgment to know when you don't have enough information to make assumptions about someone's life or experiences." The conversation was serving as an impromptu lesson in the complexities of military service and veteran reintegration, with Sarah and Morrison serving as reluctant educators for civilians who had been forced to confront their own ignorance. The teaching moment was valuable, but both veterans understood that lasting change would require sustained effort rather than The temporary discomfort of being proven wrong. Marcus, the student whose working-class background had given him some exposure to military families, approached with the visible weight of someone who felt he should have known better. "My family has a tradition of military service," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment in himself. "I was raised to respect veterans unconditionally, and instead I participated in harassing someone whose service was apparently far more significant than anything my family has done." Morrison recognized the particular pain of someone who had betrayed their own stated values under social pressure. Family traditions of respect are meaningless if they don't translate into individual courage when that respect is tested, he observed. "Your background gave you knowledge that should have prevented your participation, but knowledge without the courage to act on it doesn't protect anyone." The harsh assessment was delivered without cruelty, but with the directness that military leadership required when addressing failures that could have serious consequences. Marcus absorbed the criticism with the acceptance of someone who recognized its validity, understanding that his family's military tradition made his participation in the harassment even more inexcusable. David, the coffee shop manager, joined the conversation with the visible weight of professional responsibility. "I'm implementing new training protocols for all staff," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone making official policy decisions. "Clear guidelines for recognizing and preventing customer harassment, specific procedures for situations involving veterans or military service, and training on the complexities of military experiences that our staff should understand." Morrison approved of the institutional response, while also recognizing its limitations. "Policy changes are necessary but not sufficient," he noted. "The training needs to address not just procedures but judgment, helping staff recognize when situations require intervention, even if they don't fit standard categories." The twins, Ashley and Amanda, approached together with their phones completely put away, their influencer instincts overwhelmed by the magnitude of their moral failure. "We want to use our platforms to educate people about veteran issues," Ashley said, her voice tentative as she tried to find a way to contribute positively to the aftermath of their mistake. "But we don't want to exploit this situation or make it about us," Amanda added quickly, recognizing the danger of turning their own failure into content that served their personal brand rather than addressing the actual issues they had helped highlight. Sarah appreciated their restraint while also questioning whether social media platforms were the appropriate venue for the kind of nuanced education that veteran issues required. "The complexity of military service and veteran experiences doesn't translate well to the simplified formats that social media rewards," she observed. "Real understanding requires sustained engagement with difficult topics rather than viral content that reduces complex issues to shareable soundbites." The conversation had evolved into a broader discussion of how civilian society could better understand and support veterans, particularly those whose service existed in classified realms that prevented traditional forms of recognition and community support. The coffee shop had become an unlikely classroom where fundamental questions about military-civilian relations were being explored through the lens of a specific incident that had exposed broader systemic failures. Morrison glanced at his watch, recognizing that the extended conversation was drawing attention from remaining patrons and that both he and Sarah needed to consider the long-term implications of this public acknowledgement of her service. "Staff Sergeant Chen," he said, returning to the formal address that acknowledged her military identity, "I hope you'll consider reaching out when you're ready to explore the support options we discussed." Sarah nodded, understanding that the conversation was concluding, but that the recognition Morrison had provided would continue to resonate long after they parted. The business card in her hand represented more than contact information. It was proof that her service mattered, that her sacrifice had been noted by people who understood its significance, that her isolation was not as complete as she had believed. The quiet dignity with which both veterans had handled the afternoon's crisis, had transformed what began as harassment into an opportunity for education and growth. Though the personal cost to Sarah remained significant, regardless of the positive outcomes that might eventually emerge from the incident. The aftermath of the confrontation settled over the coffee shop like dust after an explosion, leaving everyone present to grapple with truths that extended far beyond the specific incident they had witnessed. What had begun as casual harassment, based on superficial assumptions, had evolved into a profound examination of how society treats those who serve in the shadows, whose sacrifices exist in classified files rather than public recognition, whose contributions to national security remain invisible to the very people they protect. Sarah found herself at the center of conversations she had never wanted to have, forced to articulate experiences that she had spent years learning to compartmentalize and suppress. The recognition Morrison had provided was healing, but it also reopened wounds that had scarred over through years of isolation and official non-existence. The careful balance she had constructed between her authentic identity and her necessary anonymity had been disrupted in ways that would require time and effort to reconstruct. The broader implications of what had transpired extended into realms that most of the witnesses couldn't fully comprehend. The classification systems that protected national security also created categories of veterans whose service could never be fully acknowledged, whose transition to civilian life was complicated by the requirement to maintain secrecy about experiences that had fundamentally shaped their identities. Sarah represented thousands of others who lived in similar circumstances, carrying the weight of service that society benefited from without knowing it existed. Morrison understood these complexities from his position within the military hierarchy. But even his knowledge was limited by compartmentalization and security protocols that kept different aspects of special operations separate from each other. The fact that he had recognized Sarah's service was significant, but it also highlighted how many others might remain unrecognized, their contributions lost in the bureaucratic machinery that prioritized operational security over individual recognition. Students who had initiated the harassment were beginning to comprehend the magnitude of their ignorance, but their understanding remained incomplete because the full scope of Sarah's service could never be explained to them. They were left to grapple with the knowledge that they had publicly humiliated someone whose contributions to their safety and security existed at levels they couldn't access or appreciate. The gap between their assumptions and reality was so vast that bridging it would require fundamental changes in how they approached interactions with strangers. Brandon's pledge to educate himself about veteran issues was sincere, but it was also complicated by the fact that the most significant aspects of veteran experience existed in classified realms that no amount of civilian education could illuminate. His understanding would always be limited to what was publicly accessible, leaving him with an incomplete picture of the full spectrum of military service and sacrifice. Jessica's deletion of the recorded material was important, but it also highlighted the broader problem of social media culture that prioritized viral content over human dignity. Her instinct to document and share what she perceived as stolen valor exposure was part of a larger pattern of digital behavior that treated real people's lives as entertainment content. The fact that she had been wrong about Sarah's authenticity was less important than the underlying willingness to participate in public shaming for social media engagement. The coffee shop itself had become a symbol of civilian spaces, where veterans might face judgment and harassment based on incomplete understanding of what military service entailed. David's promise to implement new policies was well-intentioned, but it also raised questions about whether institutional responses could address problems that were fundamentally rooted in broader cultural attitudes toward military service and veteran experiences. The other patrons who had witnessed the incident were left to examine their own complicity in a system that allowed harassment to continue unchecked. Many had been prepared to be entertained by what they thought was the exposure of stolen valor, revealing assumptions about veterans that were as problematic as the direct harassment Sarah had faced. Their willingness to be passive observers while someone was publicly humiliated spoke to broader questions about social responsibility and moral courage. The incident had exposed fundamental disconnects between military and civilian communities that extended far beyond individual ignorance or malice. The gap in understanding was structural, built into systems that kept military operations secret while expecting civilian society to support military personnel without comprehending what that support should entail. Sarah's experience was a case study in how these systemic failures affected individual veterans, particularly those whose service existed outside public recognition. Morrison's intervention had been crucial, but it also highlighted the random nature of recognition and support for veterans in Sarah's situation. The fact that a senior officer happened to be present with sufficient clearance to recognize her service was extraordinarily fortunate, but it raised questions about what happened to veterans who didn't benefit from such coincidental encounters. How many others lived in similar isolation, carrying the weight of classified service without any acknowledgement or support? The conversation about support systems and resources had opened possibilities for Sarah that she hadn't known existed, but it also forced her to confront decisions about how much of her carefully constructed anonymity she was willing to sacrifice for the potential benefits of reconnecting with military community. The business card Morrison had given her represented a doorway back to a world she had been forced to leave, but opening that door carried risks as well as opportunities. The practical implications of Sarah's situation extended into areas that most civilians never considered. Employment opportunities were limited by her inability to discuss her most significant qualifications and experiences. Healthcare benefits were complicated by her official status as deceased. Social connections were constrained by the requirement to maintain cover stories that prevented authentic relationships. The isolation she had learned to manage was not just emotional but practical, affecting every aspect of daily life. The student's education about veteran issues would need to encompass these hidden complexities if it was to be meaningful. Understanding veteran experiences required recognizing that military service existed on a spectrum that included not just the publicly recognized forms of combat and deployment, but also the classified operations that society depended on without acknowledging. Their harassment of Sarah had been based on stereotypes about what veterans looked like and how they behaved. But even broader education might not prepare them to recognize veterans whose service existed outside those stereotypes. The incident had also highlighted the particular challenges faced by female veterans, who were often subjected to additional skepticism about their military service based on gender stereotypes. Sarah's small stature and quiet demeanor had made her an easy target for harassment, based on assumptions about physical requirements for military service. But these assumptions ignored the reality that modern military operations required diverse skill sets that weren't necessarily correlated with traditional measures of physical strength. The intersection of classification requirements and gender bias created additional layers of isolation for female veterans whose service existed in sensitive roles. Sarah's inability to discuss her technical expertise and combat experience made it impossible for her to challenge the assumptions that led to her harassment, leaving her vulnerable to judgments based on appearances rather than actual qualifications and contributions. Morrison's recognition of her service had provided validation that she hadn't realized she needed, confirming that her contributions had been noted and appreciated by people who understood their significance. The psychological impact of that acknowledgement was profound, offering a connection to military community that she had thought was permanently severed when her official existence was erased. But the recognition also created new challenges. The public nature of Morrison's intervention meant that her anonymity in this community was compromised, requiring her to consider whether maintaining her current life was still viable or whether she needed to relocate again to maintain the security. that her situation required. The coffee shop incident would be remembered by everyone present, but the memories would be filtered through their individual perspectives and understanding. For the students, it might serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of making assumptions. For other patrons, it might highlight their own passive complicity in allowing harassment to continue. For the business, it might prompt policy changes that would protect future customers from similar treatment. For Sarah, the incident represented both violation and validation, a painful reminder of her isolation combined with unexpected recognition of her service. The complex emotions it generated would require time to process, and the practical implications would need to be carefully considered as she decided how to move forward. The broader conversation about veteran support and recognition that had emerged from the incident would continue long after the participants had left the coffee shop. The questions raised about classification requirements, civilian military understanding, and social media culture were larger than any individual incident. But Sarah's experience had provided a concrete example of how these abstract issues affected real people's lives. The recognition Morrison had provided was meaningful, but it was also temporary. When he left and returned to his duties at the Pentagon, Sarah would once again be alone with the knowledge of her service and the reality of her isolation. The business card he had given her offered possibilities, but pursuing those possibilities would require courage and careful consideration of the risks involved. The incident had transformed what should have been an ordinary afternoon into a moment of profound significance, forcing everyone present to confront uncomfortable truths about assumptions, judgment, and the hidden costs of protecting national security. The lessons learned would resonate far beyond the coffee shop, but whether they would lead to lasting change remained to be seen. The weeks that followed the coffee shop incident brought unexpected changes to Sarah's carefully ordered existence. The business card Morrison had given her remained on her kitchen table, a tangible reminder that her service had been witnessed and acknowledged by someone who understood its true significance. She found herself picking it up during quiet moments, studying the official letterhead and contact information, weighing the potential benefits of reaching out against the risks of exposing herself to scrutiny that might compromise the anonymity she had worked so hard to maintain. Her graphic design work continued as before, but she noticed subtle shifts in how she approached client interactions and public spaces. The coffee shop confrontation had reminded her how quickly assumptions could escalate into harassment, how civilians' limited understanding of military service could create dangerous situations for veterans whose experiences didn't match popular stereotypes. She became more careful about concealing her dog tags, more strategic about where she chose to work, more aware of the conversations happening around her. The psychological impact of Morrison's recognition proved more significant than she had anticipated. For years, she had carried the weight of service that existed only in classified files, contributions that would never be publicly acknowledged or understood. The validation from someone with the authority and clearance to appreciate her sacrifice had begun to heal wounds she hadn't realized were still bleeding. Sleep came easier now, and the hypervigilance that had characterized her daily existence began to soften slightly, but the healing also brought its own challenges. As the numbness of survival mode began to recede, Sarah found herself confronting emotions and memories that she had suppressed during the most difficult years of her transition to civilian life. The grief for teammates officially listed as killed in action, the anger at a system that had erased her existence for operational security, the profound loneliness of living without any connection to the military community that had once defined her identity. These feelings demanded attention now that she had space to process them. After 3 weeks of deliberation, Sarah finally made the decision to contact Morrison. The phone call was brief and professional, but it opened a door to resources she hadn't known existed. There were support networks for veterans in similar circumstances, programs designed to provide assistance without compromising operational security, and mental health services that specialized in the unique challenges faced by personnel from classified operations. The first support group meeting took place in a nondescript office building with security protocols that reminded Sarah of her military days. The other attendees were introduced only by first names, but she recognized the bearing and mannerisms that marked them as fellow veterans of special operations. Some had been officially declared dead like herself, while others had simply been removed from active duty with their service records sealed at classification levels that prevented any public acknowledgement. Listening to their stories, Sarah realized that her experience of isolation and unofficial existence was part of a larger pattern affecting hundreds of veterans whose service had been in roles too sensitive for conventional recognition. The support group provided a space where they could acknowledge their experiences without violating security protocols, where the weight of classified service could be shared with others who understood its unique burdens. The group facilitator, a former special operations officer who had transitioned to providing veteran services, explained the resources available to participants. There were employment programs that could leverage their skills without requiring disclosure of classified experience, healthcare services that understood the physical and psychological impacts of special operations, and legal assistance for navigating the complex bureaucracy that governed their unique status. Sarah began attending the meetings regularly, finding in them a connection to the military community that she had thought was permanently lost. The other participants became a new kind of unit, bound together not by operational requirements, but by shared understanding of what it meant to serve in shadows, to sacrifice visibility for security, to protect a society that could never fully appreciate the protection being provided. Through the support network, Sarah learned about veterans who had successfully rebuilt their lives despite similar circumstances. Some had found ways to use their technical skills in civilian careers that provided both financial stability and personal fulfillment. Others had discovered new purposes in helping fellow veterans navigate the challenges of transition from classified service. A few had even found ways to reconnect with family members who had believed them dead, though such reunions required careful coordination with security services to maintain operational cover. The possibilities opened by Morrison's recognition and the support network he had connected her to began to reshape Sarah's understanding of what her future might hold. The freelance graphic design work that had provided survival income could potentially evolve into something more substantial. Her technical skills, while not directly applicable to civilian contexts, had given her problem-solving abilities and attention to detail that were valuable in many fields. More importantly, the connections she was forming with other veterans in similar circumstances were providing the social foundation that civilian life had been missing. The isolation that had defined her existence since returning from Afghanistan was beginning to lift, replaced by relationships based on shared experience and mutual understanding, rather than the careful distance she had maintained with civilian acquaintances. The incident at the coffee shop had also produced unexpected ripple effects in the broader community. David, the manager who had witnessed the harassment, had followed through on his promise to implement new training protocols, but had gone beyond simple policy changes to create educational partnerships with local veteran organizations. The coffee shop began hosting monthly events where veterans could share their experiences with civilian community members, fostering the kind of understanding that might prevent future incidents. Brandon had indeed followed through on his commitment to education, volunteering with veteran service organizations, and working to understand the complexities of military experience that his privileged background had never exposed him to. His transformation from ignorant harasser to committed advocate was genuine, though Sarah remained cautious about civilian attempts to turn personal failures into opportunities for redemption and social recognition. Jessica had redirected her social media presence toward promoting veteran causes, though she was careful to center veteran voices rather than her own experience of being wrong about Sarah's authenticity. Her platform had become a space for sharing information about veteran resources and challenging the stereotypes that led to incidents like the one she had participated in. The broader conversation about veteran recognition and support that had emerged from the coffee shop incident continued to resonate through the community. Local organizations began developing programs specifically designed to support veterans whose service existed in classified realms, recognizing that traditional approaches to veteran assistance didn't address the unique challenges faced by personnel. From Special Operations, Sarah's story, though never shared in detail due to security requirements, had become a catalyst for examining how civilian society could better understand and support military service in all its forms. The incident had highlighted the gap between popular perceptions of what veterans looked like and the reality of modern military service, which increasingly relied on personnel whose skills and contributions didn't match traditional stereotypes. As autumn arrived and the leaves began to change, Sarah found herself contemplating possibilities that had seemed impossible just months earlier. The business card that had sat on her kitchen table for weeks was now accompanied by other materials. Information about veteran education benefits that might be accessible despite her unique status, job opportunities that could utilize her skills without requiring disclosure of classified experience, and contact information for other veterans who had successfully navigated similar transitions. The dog tags she wore were no longer a secret burden carried in isolation, but a connection to a community that existed outside public recognition, a brotherhood and sisterhood of those who had served in shadows and found ways to support each other through the challenges of unofficial existence. The recognition Morrison had provided had opened doors, but the real transformation had come from discovering that she was not alone, that others had faced similar challenges and found ways not just to survive, but to rebuild lives worth living. Coffee shop where the confrontation had occurred remained part of her routine, but now it held different significance. Rather than being a place where she risked exposure and harassment, it had become a symbol of how truth could emerge from conflict, how recognition could come from unexpected sources, and how the courage to acknowledge difficult realities could transform individual experiences into broader opportunities for understanding and support. 6 months later, Sarah received an unexpected email. It was from a young woman named Maria, a recent Army veteran who had seen David's coffee shop hosting a veteran support event on social media. Maria's message was brief. "I heard there might be people there who understand complicated service situations. I can't talk about most of what I did, but I'm struggling with civilian life and don't know where to turn." Sarah smiled as she typed her response, remembering her own isolation and the lifeline Morrison had thrown her. She arranged to meet Maria at the same coffee shop where her world had changed, bringing along information about the support network that had helped her rebuild her life. When they met, Sarah noticed Maria unconsciously touching something at her throat, dog tags hidden beneath her civilian clothes. The recognition was instant and mutual. As they talked, Sarah realized that her experience at the coffee shop had created something larger than personal healing. The incident had sparked conversations, policy changes, and support systems that were now helping other veterans navigate the complex space between classified service and civilian recognition. "The hardest part," Maria said, echoing Sarah's own words from months earlier, "is the isolation." "It doesn't have to be permanent," Sarah replied, thinking of the community she had found, the purpose she had rediscovered, and the recognition that had come from the most unexpected source. Stories like Sarah's remind us that heroism often wears ordinary clothes and carries invisible burdens. Every day, we encounter people whose contributions to our safety and security exist in realms we may never understand. Before we judge based on appearances or assumptions, we should remember that true strength often comes in packages that don't match our expectations. What quiet heroes have you overlooked in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reveal the extraordinary people live in ordinary lives among us.